Hello again, everyone. And this week we are going to be talking about something wonderful called the Browser Object Model. The Browser Object Model is basically a huge collection of JavaScript objects that the browser automatically constructs and makes available to us through our JavaScript code. The Browser Object Model, which is also known as the BOM, B-O-M, allows us to access these objects and thereby be able to find information about virtually anything inside the browser, and it allows us to set and work with and manipulate most everything that also goes on inside the browser. The very first object, sort of the topmost, or what we would call a root object in this hierarchy of JavaScript objects, is an object called the window object. The window object is actually an object that contains everything else that happens in JavaScript. What we'll find out here in a minute is that everything that we've been doing in this course up to this point has actually been working with the window object. The window object itself is kind of like other objects in that it contains attributes. For example, an inner height attribute, which tells us the height of the part of the browser window where the document is displayed. The window object also contains methods like other objects, like the alert and the prompt method that we've worked with many times are actually methods of the window object. Besides these attributes and methods, the window object also contains other objects, sub-objects you might call them. These sub-objects then themselves may also contain other attributes, methods, and sub-objects. So all of these things taken together end up forming a huge hierarchy, a huge tree, where the window object is at the top and everything else is contained inside of it. One of the things that's interesting about the window object, like I mentioned before, is that we've been working with it really all along, but JavaScript is kind of interesting in the way that it treats the window object in that we never actually have to specify it. Basically, anytime we think we're not working with an object at all and we don't actually specify the name of an object, what we are doing is actually working with the window object. For example, we declare a variable called x and assign it a value of 10. What we're actually doing is creating a new attribute of the window object called x that has a value of 10. Whenever we create a new function, this function, for example, called testIt, what we're actually doing is we're creating another attribute inside the window object and assigning to it the new function that we've created. So the window object is always there, it's always behind the scenes. What we have here is a simple little JavaScript script, very much like things we've seen before. What I'm actually doing here is creating a variable called name and assigning it the string Roland. I then use a document.writeLine to print out the value of the name variable, so of course that will print out Roland. I have a function here that I've defined. The function is called showAlert, and it is passed a variable, which is stored here in a variable called message. Whatever variable it's passed will then be passed on to an alert, so the alert will actually pop up and show us whatever value we pass to the function. And then the last thing I have here in this script is actually calling the showAlert function. If we go over and we take a look at this in our web browser, you can see there's the alert that pops up with my message, and there's Roland being printed out by the document.writeLine. Everything is pretty much just like we've done it before, but the thing that's a little bit different now is that we know where these things actually come from. The name variable, for example, is actually part of the window object. So for example, if I were to do window.name, you'll notice that the script still runs exactly the same way. So when we were talking about just name, JavaScript was substituting in the window dot automatically for us, knowing that everything that's created is actually a part of that window object. Our showAlert function here, if I were to actually do window.showAlert, you see that everything still works exactly like it was before. So the window object is always there. JavaScript just simply never requires us to actually type it in. We don't have to put window dot in front of everything. One other place we could put it in if we wanted to, not that there'd be any realistic reason to do it, is we could do window.document.writeLine, since the document object itself is also actually a part of the window object. And again, you can see everything keeps working just the way it was. One other fun little thing that we can actually do here with the window object is if we want to, we can actually take a peek inside of it and see what all we actually have in there to work with. You might remember from a previous cast when we were talking about the for in structure, what I could do is I could say for x in window, right? From what we talked about previously, we know that what's going to happen here is that the for in structure is going to take each one of the separate attribute names that's available inside window and put it here into the variable called x. So inside this loop then, if I do a document.writeLine and I print out the value of x, which is the attribute name, followed by a string literal equal sign, and then I'll follow that with window element x, what it'll actually do for us here is it will print out every attribute name that's available under window, followed by an equal sign, followed by the actual value of that particular attribute. So if we take that and we actually run it, we get a lot of stuff in there. And it looks like I forgot to put in a break, so it's all kind of jammed together. Let me go back and put that break in after each one of those so it's a little cleaner. There we go. There's everything that we actually have inside the window object. You see there's the document object that lives inside the window object itself, right? Here's my show alert function that I defined. So that's not a function that is a standard part of the window object. That's actually my function that I wrote, and you see the rest of its body actually listed right there, along with a great many other things. There are a lot of different methods, a lot of different attributes or variables, all available here through the window object, and whenever we want to access any of them, we can leave the window dot off the front and just work with them the way they are. There's my name variable with Roland in it. I just realized there was one other place where I could have put in window that I didn't, and that was here with the alert. The alert method is actually one of the methods of the window object, so if I do window.alert, it'll be the exact same thing as just saying alert. Now, see, everything still works just the way it did before. So there's really no point in showing this to you other than just to demonstrate that all of these different things that we've been working with previously, simple variables, document.writeLine, alert, functions that we write, the really only point in all of this, in this particular example, is just to show you that indeed those things are actually a part of the window object. We don't really have to know that. We don't ever have to specifically work with them as if they come from the window object, but it is a good thing to keep in mind, to sort of stay in that frame of mind that we're always working inside the browser object model one way or another. While the window object is interesting, it's not one that we generally have to worry about too much day in and day out. We never have to specify the window object in any way, so it's kind of always just there, anonymous in the background, doing what it's supposed to do, and generally we don't have to pay it very much mind. But one other part of the browser object model, the part that starts off with the document object at its root, is a part that we will work with extensively, and it's a part of this hierarchy that is so interesting. It's actually been given its own name. It's called the document object model, and it's often referred to as being the DOM. The document object model is a lot like the browser object model that it's a part of. The difference is, while the browser object model contains everything, including many different aspects of the browser itself, the document object model simply represents whatever HTML document the browser currently has loaded, so it is literally the document itself. How this comes about is that whenever we create an HTML file and load it into the browser will actually take the tags that we write into our HTML and convert them into JavaScript objects. For example, here I have an input tag for a text field like you would find in many different forms. So you'll notice that this input tag has 3 different attributes, type, value, and name, each one of them assigned a value. When the browser actually reads this tag, what it will do is, in response, is create a JavaScript object from it. Each one of the 3 different attributes of the tag will become attributes of the object, with the values stored there along with the names. Once that conversion has taken place, that HTML tag then, in essence, through that object, becomes accessible to us through our JavaScript code. Where does the browser then actually put this object once it's created it? Well, that depends on where that tag was actually placed in the HTML document itself. For example, if this input tag was just one of 2 input tags that were included as part of a form, what the browser would do is it would actually take each of the 2 input tags and turn them into their own object. So we would have a JavaScript object that had a name value of first name and a JavaScript object with a name value of last name. Just like in the HTML, we had 2 input tags whose names were first name and last name. It would also take the form itself and turn it into an object, with any attributes of the form tag becoming attributes of that object representing the form. The browser would then take those three objects and arrange them with each other the way that they are actually arranged in the same hierarchy and the same order that they were in the HTML file. So it would set the first name and the last name input tag objects up as children or sub-objects below the form object. A lot of the different objects that are available inside the document object model, the browser makes easily accessible to us. For example, below the document object, a special array is created called the forms array. Into that forms array, the browser will automatically put any forms that are translated into JavaScript objects from the current page, so that we have quick, easy access to them simply by doing document.forms and specifying an index number. The browser does the exact same thing with images. Any image tags that are found inside the document are automatically translated into JavaScript objects and then included, automatically then put into the images array. Because the browser makes forms quickly and easily accessible to us in JavaScript, they are something that we can work with from within JavaScript fairly easily. To demonstrate this, I'm going to start off by actually putting in a form tag. I'm going to leave the action for the form tag blank because I'm not actually going to have this thing submit anywhere. And I'm going to assign the method of post to the form. Right? So there's my set of form tags, my little valid form. Inside the form tag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a text field. Text, not test. I'm going to give the text field, let's see, actually I think I'll leave that text field just like it is for right now. So that gives me a very simple little form. Actually, one more thing I'm going to add. Let me put in a submit button. Something like that. I'll just put in the word submit on the button itself. If I go over and take a look at that in my browser, there's my simple little form. I can click on the input field and type in whatever I'd like to right there. If I hit submit, of course, nothing will really happen because I did not set this form up to actually submit anywhere. But with that little form in there, we could actually then have some JavaScript come in and be able to access the different parts of this form. Right? So I've taken and I've put a set of script tags down below the form, which is actually at this point is kind of important, the actual placement of those script tags. If I plan on putting some JavaScript in here that's going to access and work with the form, it's of course important that the form already exists. And by exist I mean that the form has already been read and turned into JavaScript objects made a part of the DOM by the browser. So if I were to put the code to access the form above the form somewhere in the code, then my code would of course fail. My JavaScript would fail because the browser would not yet have seen and recognized and interpreted that form. So putting the script that's going to access the form below it here for the moment is going to be an important thing. Just to kind of show you what we could do, let me go ahead and in here put something like document.forms element 0. Right? Document.forms element 0 means that we're accessing an array called forms, which is a part of the document object. This forms array is created for us automatically and is automatically filled with any forms that the browser finds when it renders the document. The reason I'm using forms element 0 is that the 0 is going to indicate that what I want to work with is the first form in this page. Now on this particular page there is only one form, so we find that there's a form 0, but there won't be anything else in any other elements of the forms array. But on a page where we could potentially have multiple forms, we'd be able to access each one of them by changing this number, changing the index number that we're giving to the forms array. And the forms will simply be listed in that array in the same order that they are actually written in the HTML. The first form being form 0, the second form in the HTML being forms 1, and so on and so forth. Once I actually get to this point, there's lots of different things I could do. I could, for example, take a look at the method attribute of the form itself. If I maybe, for example, take that and put it inside a document.writeLine and ask it to print out the method of form 0 from inside this document, what I actually get when I look at it in my browsers, there you see it comes up and it says post. So what actually, of course, happened here was when the browser was reading down through this HTML file, when it encountered this form tag, it created a new form object as part of the DOM. Inside that form object, it put in an attribute called method and assigned it a value of post, and it put in an action attribute and assigned it a blank string. So down here in my JavaScript then, when I say go into the document, access the first form, and give me the value of the method, of course what I get back is post, the exact same thing I had up here. If I were to change that to get, and pull that back up into my browser, you can see that indeed the JavaScript is actually reading the value that originated there in that HTML tag. There are lots of other things I can do with it besides that. Right? For example, things get a little bit more interesting. Instead of looking at the form itself, we start looking at the actual text field in here. Now this text field by default always comes up blank because we did not assign a value to it. But of course, if we wanted to put something in there, we could put in a value attribute in the HTML and say this is a test, for example. Right? In which case, whenever I pull it up in the browser, that will be the default text that will be filled into that field. But I could actually do the exact same thing from JavaScript. Instead of having it written here in the static HTML, I could have JavaScript potentially dynamically decide what value to actually fill into that field for us. So I could do something, for example, like document.forms0. Okay? To actually get to that text field, what we'll find is that inside the forms array, inside an individual form object in the forms array, there's actually another array in there called elements. The elements array is again an array, and it works sort of like the forms array, where the elements array will contain each one of the separate form controls that are actually put into the form. We can access them in the order that they are written. So inside this form, the very first form control is this text field, so that will be elements 0. The second and last form control that's a part of this form is my submit button, so that will be elements 1. So if I come down here and I say go to elements 0 in form 0, I could say assign it a value of JavaScript, put this here. Right? And if I then go pull this up in my browser, you can see I end up with JavaScript put this here. So there my JavaScript actually filled a value into a text field for us. And of course we could access values from text field as well. But at the moment, since it's something that only is going to happen at the time the page is actually loaded, it wouldn't be a very interesting thing to actually do. Just to kind of show you a little bit more about that, if I go to element forms, still form 0, but this time I'm going to access elements 1, right? What I'm talking about in that particular case is my submit button. So if I assign a new value to the submit button, this is the submit button, for example, then what's actually going to happen here is that the value that's being assigned to the value attribute of my submit button by JavaScript will replace the default value that was actually put here in the HTML. So the HTML says to put the value submit on the button, but after that's done, the JavaScript's then going to come back after the fact and say, now change the value to this is the submit button. And if I look at it in my browser, sure enough. So there from my JavaScript, I was able to access a value associated with the form, and I was able to manipulate two different form elements, a text field and my actual submit button. There'll be a whole lot more that we can actually do with this later once we start learning about events, and we can actually have different things triggered by the user at a later time, so everything doesn't have to happen immediately when the page is first loaded, but we'll get to that eventually. Something we can do with forms or anything else that's being accessed from the DOM, well, forms and images anyway, is that if we want to simplify the accessing of them, we can actually assign different parts of our HTML names. For example, I'm accessing my form right now by going through the forms array. Forms element 0 is giving me access to this particular form since it's the first form on the page. If I didn't like dealing with that array, something that I could do instead is I could actually assign that form a name. So I could call this, for example, first form. Right? Whenever you assign a name to a form, you can then use that name in place of the actual form array. So just like we were doing, what was I doing? Oh, like up here where I was doing my document.writeLine to get the method of the form, and it was coming back and giving me get at the moment. Instead of doing forms 0 right here, if I instead did now first form, the name of the form that I've added to it, you'll notice that over in the browser it still works exactly the same way. I'm still able to access its attribute. So a lot of people prefer being able to access forms through a name, and if you are in a situation where a page has multiple forms, or if the forms are being moved around during development, this certainly can help avoid some confusion, especially if the order that the forms are written in changes for some reason. So in any place now where I am where I'm working with form 0, I could now put first form in its place and everything will keep right on working. There we go. And everything's just like it was. We can do the same exact thing with form controls. For example, my text field here, if I called this the test field, for example, then down in my JavaScript, whenever I would normally access element 0, which is the first element, the first form control in that particular form, I could now get rid of that and use the actual field's name instead, test field, for example. And you see everything still works exactly the way it was. So we do have those two different options when it comes to accessing different parts of the DOM tree, at least as far as forms are concerned, in that we can access them sort of generically through the pre-built arrays that JavaScript makes available to us, or we can actually assign names to them and then using those names be able to access different forms and different parts of forms. From within JavaScript, I can access images with about the same level of ease as I'm able to access forms. Just as an example, I'm going to put an image tag here into the body of my document. What I actually have is on my desktop, I have two different duck images. I have one called duck01.jpg, which is a picture of a real duck. At least it looks real to me. And then I have an image called duck02.jpg, which is an image of, yeah, I don't think that's a real duck. Kind of a rubber ducky. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start my image tag off here by pulling up the actual image of the duck, the real duck, by putting in duck01.jpg as the source for my image tag. If I look at it in my browser, there's my image of the real duck. Now what I could potentially do is I could have JavaScript also access that particular image tag. I could do something like, for example, document.images element 0, which again, just like with the forms, indicates that what we're accessing is the very first image tag on this particular page. And then I'm going to say the attribute of that image that I want to work with is the source attribute. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the image of duck02.jpg. So in essence, what's happening here is that the HTML will start off by putting in one picture, but then as soon as we execute down a little bit further and the JavaScript starts running, the JavaScript will then replace the first duck image with the second duck image instead. And if I look at it now in my browser, sure enough, the image has been replaced. Again, later when we talk about events, that will be a very interesting thing that we'll be able to do. We'll be able to use JavaScript to do image rollovers, for example, where whenever the mouse pointer rolls over an image, we will have that act as a trigger, which then at that point will tell JavaScript to swap to a different image and then to change back when the mouse pointer moves away. Let's see, in my HTML right now I don't have an alt attribute, which I certainly should in order to be valid, so maybe I'll put in the alt attribute real duck. Okay. If I go back over to my browser now, hit refresh and let my mouse pointer hover, we're not quite getting it. It's not popping up the alt attribute. That might be Firefox that does that. Let me try putting in a title attribute as well. Real duck. Oops. I shouldn't have picked ducks. Too many bad misspellings can happen there. Let's see if I get the title to pop up now. Yeah, there it is, real duck. So that title and alt attributes, just like the source attribute, because they are attributes, they become a part of the JavaScript objects and can therefore be manipulated from JavaScript. So I could say for the 0th element on this page, change the alt attribute so that it will be equal to fake duck. Right? And I guess if I wanted to save myself a little bit of coding, just a little bit, I could say document images element 0 dot title will equal that same thing. So I've just chained 3 assignments together here. The string literal fake duck will be assigned to the alt attribute, and that thing's attribute, or that thing's value, will then be assigned to the title attribute. So I get everything all set up all at once. If I look at it again in my web browser and let my mouse pointer hover, you can see I'm now getting fake duck. So we're changing what image is being shown from JavaScript, we're changing the alt attribute and the title attribute, all of those things. The alt attribute is kind of an interesting one to think about in a way, because there's really no way for us to visually be able to tell whether it's actually changed or not, which is again another one of those situations where the developer tools in your browser can come in handy. If I come up to my develop menu here and I choose Web Inspector, what it will actually let me do is see the HTML as it's been manipulated by JavaScript. So the original HTML that the browser pulled up, of course, had duck01, real duck, but with my JavaScript having executed at this point, you can see those values have all actually been changed. Unfortunately, not all of the objects in a document are made as easily accessible to us as forms and images. Paragraphs, spans, headers, all of the multitude of other tags that we include in an HTML page that aren't forms or images are a little bit trickier to access. And what the browser does for us in those cases is it provides us these two methods, getElementsByTagName and getElementById. Notice that the first method name is plural, getElements, multiple elements, whereas the second one is singular, getElement, just one element. The way these methods basically work with the first one, getElementsByTagName, is we simply pass it the name of a tag. For example, if I wanted to retrieve all of the paragraph tags on a page, I could call getElementsByTagName and pass it the letter P, the same as the HTML tag's name. That would then return to me an array which contained all of the paragraph objects that were created as a result of loading this page. The getElementById method, whenever we use it, we simply pass it an ID that has been set on one of our HTML tags. In response to that method being called, the browser will find the one object that has that particular ID and will return it by itself. If it can't find an object that has that ID, it will instead return null. Whenever we want to access a JavaScript object representing one of our HTML tags, other than forms and images, we have to go about it a slightly different way. For example, if I have an HTML file here and inside it I put in a variety of different paragraph tags, let's say. Let me fix what I just did there. I'll call this one para1, maybe another paragraph tag, para2, and let's put in a third. This one I'm going to put in para3. Then of course I have all three of those paragraph tags as a part of my HTML document. You can see they all actually show up there in my browser. But because those three paragraphs are not forms and they are not images, I cannot access them quite as easily, quite as directly as I was able to access forms and images through my JavaScript. That doesn't mean, of course, that they can't be accessed. It just means that we have to go about it a slightly different way. What I'm going to do is, after my three paragraphs, I'm going to put in a set of script tags. And what I can do here is if I want to access those three paragraphs, I can do so by using the getElementsByTagName method. There we go. The getElementsByTagName method is actually a part of any HTML container element. So any element inside JavaScript that can contain other elements, like a paragraph itself, for example, or what I'm actually going to use here is the document. So from the document, I ask it to give me all of the elements that have a particular tag name, and then all I have to do here is tell it what tag name I actually want. So in essence, what I'm saying here is I'm saying, hey document, give me all the elements that have the tag name P. So what it will then do is it will find all of the paragraph elements in this document and will return them to me as an array. I'm going to need a variable then to store those in, so I'm going to create a new variable called PArray. There we go. And that's where all of my paragraphs will actually then be stored. Now, until we get a little bit further into this, there isn't going to be much that we can actually do with those paragraphs, but we can, for example, just do a document.writeLine and confirm that they actually were retrieved. If I, for example, here take a look at the length of the PArray, what we should have is an element inside PArray for each one of the different paragraphs that's inside this page. So I have 3 separate paragraphs, so the size of my array should be 3 if everything's working the way it should. If I come over and take a look at it in my browser, sure enough, 3 is what I get. If in the HTML I get rid of one of those paragraphs, so now there's only 2, Okay, now you can see that the JavaScript is telling me that it only found 2 paragraphs. So using the getElementsByArray method of any container object, I am able to retrieve any object that I might potentially happen to want. I could assign values to them and work with their attributes and do all the things that we typically are able to do, like we saw with forms and images. Very similar to the way we were using the getElementsByTagName method to be able to retrieve all of the tags within a container of a particular name, anytime a situation calls for us to just retrieve a single element of some sort, we can do that by using the getElementById method. So let me put a tag in here. Maybe I'll just put in a horizontal rule. If I come over and I take a look at that in my browser, you can see what the default horizontal rule looks like. It's basically gray. It's about as wide as the window. Everything about it's very sort of normal. If I wanted to be able to access that horizontal rule, I could of course use the getElementsByTagName method, but if that was a particular tag that was special in some way and I wanted to be able to access it all by itself, I could assign an ID to it. Maybe I'll give it the ID of rule. I could then access it inside my JavaScript by doing document.getElementById and giving it the ID. So in this case, the ID is rule. What JavaScript will do is it will search out the particular element that has that particular ID and will return the JavaScript object representation of it back to me. So I'm going to make a variable here, maybe I'll call it R for rule, and I'll then be able to access it. In accessing it, I could do any of the normal things I could typically do from the HTML, like for example, I could change its width property to maybe 50%. If I look at it now in my browser, you can see that the rule is now only 50% the width of the window. But one way or another, in this particular case, we're able to access the element by using its ID instead of retrieving all of the elements of that same type, which a lot of times can be a lot more straightforward, a lot less code and extra objects to work through. If there's simply one object that you want to be able to change, the getElementById method comes in handy for just that sort of thing. So what kinds of things can we do with the DOM and with the browser object model? Well, 2 things that immediately come to mind are CSS manipulation and what we call DHTML or dynamic HTML. Starting off with CSS manipulation, it's actually pretty straightforward considering everything else that we've seen here. What it assumes is that you remember that we can do inline CSS. In essence, instead of putting CSS in the head section or in an external file, we can actually set CSS properties directly inside a tag by using the style attribute. Well, since the style attribute is just that, an attribute, whenever the browser reads that style attribute, it automatically makes it a part of the object that is created as a result of having read that tag. Since it is just an attribute of that JavaScript object, then, from JavaScript we'll be able to manipulate its values, therefore manipulating the CSS properties of that particular object. The process of manipulating CSS through JavaScript really isn't all that much different than setting a value to go into a text field in a form. What's really crucial about it is that you just simply have to remember that CSS can be set through the style attribute of any particular tag. So what I've actually done here, for example, is I've put in a div, I've given it an ID of div1, and then I've put in a style attribute where I've put in some CSS properties for it. I've set its background color to red, I've set its width to 100 pixels, and its height to 100 pixels. So if I go over and take a look at that in my browser, you can see that I have a 100 by 100 red square there. I could actually do the exact same thing from inside JavaScript. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to give myself a different div. I'm going to call this one div2, and I'm going to leave it just like that. Because there's nothing in the div and there's no CSS for it, by default it shows up basically as being invisible. It's 0 by 0 in size and has a transparent background color, so we can't see it at all. But I could now go back in with my JavaScript and I could actually access and manipulate the CSS properties of that second div. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new variable for myself called d, and what I'm going to put into that variable is the value that I get back when I call getElementById and I ask it to get for me div2. So that's actually going to go back through the document and find the div or find the element whose ID is div2. That particular object will then be returned to me and stored here in the variable d. If I want to change its CSS, all I have to do then is d.style. All right. Now, the way that CSS manipulation is just a little bit different than some of the things we've seen before is that the CSS properties like background color, width, height, and those sorts of things actually become sub-elements below this style element, which is itself actually an object. So if I wanted to, say, put a background color on it, what I would do is I'd say d.style.background color. Okay? And then I would assign to it whatever background color I want. Maybe I'll make this one blue, for example. One other thing to be on the lookout for is that some CSS properties have hyphens in their names. It's not legal to have a variable name in JavaScript that has a hyphen in it. So whenever you're working with a CSS property that would normally have a hyphen in it, what you do is you leave out the hyphen and instead capitalize the next letter. So background hyphen color becomes background color with a capital C. Right? I could go ahead and set the width and height by doing d.style.width equals, and I'll make it 100 pixels. If I want to set its height, d.style.height, E-I-G-H-T, yeah, that's right, is 100 pixels. And if I come over and take a look at it in my browser now, you can see that through my manipulation in JavaScript, I have taken that otherwise invisible div and I've instead made it big and blue so we can actually see it and work with it. There's a million different places we can do this sort of thing, lots of fun little things that we can do. For example, let's start a new file. There it is. Not much to look at right now. What I'm going to do down here inside the body, though, is I am going to put in, let's say, an H1 tag that says maybe this is the title, right? And I think I'm going to give that H1 tag an ID just to make it easy for me to retrieve it. I'll give it the ID of title. Okay? What I'm going to do then is I want to manipulate it using JavaScript, and I think what I want to actually manipulate in it this time is going to be its font size. So if I were to, for example, do something like var title equals document.getElement by ID title, then I'm able to retrieve that particular element and work with it. So I could do something like title.style.font size. Again, that's one of those hyphenated attributes, so I get rid of the hyphen and I capitalize something. And let's say set its font size to 50 pixels. All right. There we go. That's what it ends up looking like. All right. So I actually took and made the title larger here. But what I could do with it to make it a little bit more exciting is I could actually have JavaScript continuously change the value of font size. The way that I would want to do that would not actually in this case be with a loop, because a loop would happen so fast that it would never actually have a chance to render. Instead, in the window object, there is a very handy method called setInterval. There we go. A setInterval itself is sort of something like a loop. What it will actually do is it will call a little bit of code of my choosing at a specified interval repeatedly. It'll just keep calling it over and over again. So what I actually do with the setInterval method here is I need to give it two different arguments. The first one is going to be the JavaScript code that I want it to execute. The second thing I give it is the number of milliseconds between executions that I want it to wait. So if I told it to wait 1,000 milliseconds, that would mean execute once every second. Maybe right now while we're testing it, I'll tell it to execute once every half second. Okay? And I think what I'll do here for the actual code is I'm going to make up a function called change size, right? And it'll be the change size function that will actually change the size of the font. So I'm going to come down here a little bit below. I'm going to create my function called change size. There we go. And I'm going to have the change size function access this title. So I think I'll just leave that where it is for right now. And then this is basically going to go here inside the function. Right? At the moment, there's really no point in the interval itself because right now the change size function is always setting the size to 50 pixels. So every 50 pixels it gets changed to 50 pixels, or every half second it gets changed to 50 pixels. So it never really changes. What I'd want to do here inside this function is actually have it come up with a way to increase or decrease the size as it kind of ticks through the half seconds. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make myself a variable. I'm going to call it current size. Right? And I think I'll start it off at maybe maybe 25 pixels. Maybe put that in as a string. All right. Actually, you know, now that I think about it, I'm going to leave the pixel part off, and I'm just going to store that as a number because I'm going to want to do a little bit of arithmetic to it. All right. Then what I'm going to do here inside change size is inside my change size function is I'm going to say that every time this function's called, what I want it to do is to set the font size of the title to whatever current size is. I'm going to pre-increment current size, so it will get larger by 1 every time, and then I'm going to append the pixels onto the end of it there. So let's see what that does over in our browser. If I hit refresh, oh, wait, did I just see something? Doesn't really seem to be changing that much. Kind of odd. Okay, let's try something else here. Let's try putting an alert here inside the change size function just to make sure that it's actually running. There we go. Refresh. Should be happening much, much faster than that. Let's see if we have any errors. Nope, we sure don't. That's kind of funny. Very unusual. What could be going wrong here? Oh, does my change size function here need parentheses? It just might. Let's look. There we go. Uh-oh, I forgot. This is basically an infinite loop. There's no way for me to get out of this other than to have really quick fingers. There we go. Let me quit. There. And let me reopen my browser again. All right. Oh, I don't want to pull that page back up, at least not with that infinite loop still in it the way that it is now. Let me get the alert out of there, and then that'll make it not such a big deal. We can go ahead and pull it up and watch our title grow. There. So every half second it grows by 1 pixel. And it will essentially, at the moment, kind of keep going forever. So what I would actually want to do next is I would want to include something here inside my change size function to at some point have it actually reverse direction. I think an if-else statement should probably do the trick. I could say, for example, if the current size is, let's say, less than 100, then keep doing what we were doing, increasing the size. But if the current size is not less than 100, right, then it needs to go back the other direction. Except that wouldn't exactly work, would it? Right. The idea was we start decrementing at that point. I think we actually need to keep track of the direction, though. So probably what we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to add another variable. I'm going to call it direction, and I'm going to initialize it to up. So we'll have that variable either get set to up or down to let us know which way we're going. So let's change this around a little bit. Let's say if direction is equal to up, then we're going to increase the font size. And then inside here we'll do another if statement where we'll say if current size is greater than 100, then set direction equal to down. That'll be the case where we reverse and start going back the other direction. Right? Now if the direction isn't up, then the direction must be down, which means we're going to decrement. And inside here I'll say if the current size is less than 25, then change the direction to up. Tell it to start growing again. So a series of nested ifs and else is there, which hopefully will get this thing going in the right direction. I think I'm going to go ahead and speed up the interval a little bit at this point to make it go a little bit faster, every 100 milliseconds, and let's see what we actually get. Wow, look at it still growing there from last time. Anyway, I'm going to hit refresh and start it again from the beginning. There it is, getting bigger. When it gets to 100, there it is. It hit 100 and then it starts going back down. Now when it gets down to 25, it'll change directions again and start going back up. There we go. Right? So the set interval function, which is actually a part of the window object, is something a little bit like a loop, except it's a timed loop where we can specify how fast we want something to run. Let's speed it up a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Okay. That combined with some of the control structures and some CSS manipulation, basically changing the font size dynamically from JavaScript here, we can achieve that sort of interesting effect. Interesting from an academic standpoint, I guess. I certainly hope I don't actually see that on anybody's web page. With dynamic HTML, things get a little bit more complicated and interesting. What dynamic HTML actually allows us to do is to, through JavaScript, actually manipulate the DOM tree itself, basically adding, removing, or changing any of the different nodes or parts that happen to be a part of the DOM tree, which means that we can add elements to a page that the HTML didn't specify. We can remove elements from a page that HTML had previously put there, and basically take an entire web page and put it entirely under the control of JavaScript. DHTML in JavaScript is going to allow us to actually manipulate the DOM tree itself. By manipulate the DOM tree, I mean in essence what we're going to be able to do is to actually add elements to a page, remove elements from a page, or manipulate elements that are already on a page simply from within our JavaScript code. So just as a simple example of this, what I actually have here is I of course have my HTML document, and inside the HTML document I've given myself a set of div tags that have an ID of content. Currently those div tags are empty, there's nothing at all in them. If I switch over to my browser and actually look at this page, of course the title shows up at the top, the H1, but nothing else is actually appearing in the body. If I come up to my develop menu and I go to the web inspector, I can see what the browser is actually kind of making of the body. You can see that it has the H1 tags there, it has my empty div tags. It doesn't even bother showing the closing div tags because there's nothing inside of it, so it considers it to just sort of be self-closing. What I can do is if I come back over and I add in a little bit of JavaScript code, I could actually put elements into that div that of course were not put there by the HTML itself. And it can be a little bit complicated in the way that this actually gets done. But basically the way it's going to go is I'm going to start by retrieving the actual content div so that I can access it and add new things to it. So I'm going to create a variable, I'm going to call it div, and to actually get it I'm going to do document.getElementById so I can retrieve the thing called content. That's its ID. All right. Now, when I actually want to put something into that div, what I actually have to do is first create the thing that I want to put inside of it. So let's just say, for example, that I wanted to put a paragraph into that div. What I could do is I could create a new variable, I'll call it P, because what it's actually going to store is going to be a new paragraph element. And then I can create a new paragraph by using another method of containers called createElement. Who would have ever guessed to call it that? All right. What you do with the createElement method is you simply pass it an HTML tag name. So if I want to create a paragraph element, basically a set of P tags, what I do is I pass it the name P. The createElement method then will actually create an actual paragraph object for me, which I will then store here in my variable called P. At that point, that paragraph exists. It is in the computer's memory, but it's not actually a part of the DOM tree. So if I want that paragraph to actually show up or to actually become a part of the document, what I then have to do is actually add it to some particular point or append it to some place inside the DOM tree. So I'm going to take the div that is already a part of the DOM tree and I'm going to say append child P. So I'm taking the paragraph that I just created and I'm appending it, basically putting it inside the div tags that are already there. If I come back over to my browser and hit refresh, you'll see that we still can't see anything. But if I come back up to my web inspector, you can see that the content div now has an arrow next to it I can click, and inside of it, sure enough, there is a P tag in there that wasn't there before. What of course would make this oh so much better was if that paragraph actually had some text inside of it. If I actually want to create some text, one of the ways that I can do that is that I can start off by creating a variable. Maybe I'll call my variable tn. You'll find out why here in a second. And then I can call a method called createTextNode. The createTextNode method will basically just create a line of text or a small body, a snippet of text for me, whatever I pass to it here. This is a text node I'll put in there, for example. Right? So the create text node method will take the string literal I've provided to it there, will turn it into an actual text node suitable for being added to the DOM. So that text node object that I've actually have stored here in my variable tn can then be appended to my paragraph, which I've created. So I could do p.append child tn. So there I'm actually taking the text node and putting it inside the paragraph. And then I still have the line down here where I'm then taking the paragraph, which now includes a text node, and I'm putting it into the div. If I go back over and look at it in my browser now, you can see this is a text node now shows up. And again, if I look at it in my web inspector, I can get a little bit of better sense of exactly what happened. I have my original div called content, and you can see that I've now dynamically added a paragraph with some text inside of it. All of that from JavaScript. Here, there's of course absolutely no reason that I would actually go through and build a page using JavaScript this way. It's obviously much wordier and harder to keep track of, not nearly as convenient as it would have been for me to just type in some HTML and some text. But of course the magic of JavaScript later will be that of course this can be done dynamically. We'll be able to have the JavaScript, for example, take a value out of a form and add it as actual content onto the page. For example, at the bottom of a picture, maybe people can leave comments. They could actually type their comments into a little form, hit submit. The JavaScript could then take the comments out of the comment form and immediately append it in with the rest of the comments about that picture. No page reload necessary. You tend to see this kind of DHTML DOM manipulation used a lot in what they call the Web 2.0 type websites, where they're using Ajax and all of that fancy sort of stuff. This tends to be kind of the root of where a lot of those capabilities actually come from. So here we saw some different methods like the create element method, the create text node method, the append child method. There are a great many other methods besides those that can also be used for doing DOM manipulation. For example, here I didn't do anything that actually removed anything from the page. But we'll kind of hit those as we come to them, as there's quite a few of them, and there's really no point in just going over them right now with no reason to do it other than to do it. Certainly one of the best things to do is to get a hold of some good documentation for learning about these. DHTML is complicated and there's a lot that goes into it, so something I would certainly recommend that you do is find a good online resource for whatever browser you like that describes some of the different DOM manipulation features and capabilities that are available in that browser. These are the three URLs that I usually keep on hand. The first one is for Firefox, the second for Safari, and the last one for Internet Explorer. There are lots of different references online. These are sort of the official documentation from the companies that make those three browsers. I personally like the Firefox documentation the best, despite the fact that I typically use Safari most frequently. I think the Firefox documentation is simply the best laid out and the easiest to understand and to find what you're looking for. But certainly do a little bit of searching with Google and find yourself some good references that lay out what methods and attributes are available inside the DOM, so you have some idea of what kind of tools that you'll have to work with when you're doing DHTML.